Explicit cursors. What is an explicit cursor? Unlike an implicit cursor, which is declared automatically, an explicit cursor is declared by the programmer. An explicit cursor allows precise, row-by-row program control. By this we mean that an explicit cursor will allow explicit or specific access to each row in the cursor. Explicit cursors have certain requirements that the programmer is required to do in PL/SQL. Explicit cursors must be, firstly, they must be declared, they have to be opened, each row must be fetched and processed row by row, and finally, when an explicit cursor is finished with, it must be closed. If an explicit cursor is not closed, eventually cursor limits will build up on the database, causing problems for the database administrator and ultimately performance problems. Explicit cursors can be created precisely with an exact SQL statement, or they can also be created generically, or sometimes referred to as dynamically. In other words, you can create a SQL statement in a PL/SQL procedure where the SQL statement creates a cursor where the SQL code is generated on the fly. So for instance, you could have a procedure that passes a table parameter in that reads data from a different table depending on what the table parameter is. Obviously it must be a table parameter existing in a schema that is either your own schema or another schema that you have access to. Cursors can also be passed as biref parameters. Let's go and look at some examples of explicit cursors. I have three somewhat different cursor examples. These are not really complex cursors, but they should serve to show more or less how to build very simple explicit cursors. In the first example, I declare the cursor in the declaration section with a record which matches the structure of the cursor, which happens to be the structure of the ACT table. So my ACT table has an ACT ID and a name column. The record for this cursor is declared as being the row type of the ACT table. Now first of all, there's something I should do. If I describe the ACT table, I still have my equipment and cast object columns. I'm simply going to drop those columns for now. I've dropped the two extra object columns in the ACT table.